Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Professor Rockford. I organized this series, and this event is part of a series titled STEAM, Bridging Art Across Disciplines. Each speaker will share how science, technology, or engineering have been incorporated into their art. Our speaker tonight is Richard Dupont. His practice is based in New York City. Richard received a BA in Visual Art and Archaeology from Princeton University, where his interest in history and the philosophical topic of existence began. His solo museum exhibitions include the Queens Museum in New York, the Middlebury College Museum of Art, and the Hudson Valley Center for Contemporary Art. He has presented major installations at Beaver House and the Flag Art Foundation in New York City. His works are included in over 30 collections and museums, including the Museum of Modern Art, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, the Cleveland Museum of Art, the Brooklyn Museum, and the New York Public Library print collection, among many others. Richard has been at the forefront of experimentation with using new technologies in his art. Beginning in 2002, when few people knew or used the technology, he began to utilize 3D scanning, digital morphing, and 3D printing for his art. Richard emphasizes that his works are metaphysical or philosophical, and these technologies are used to raise questions concerning the essence of human existence. Richard is perhaps in the same mindset as the legendary artist Namjoon Paik, who was quoted as saying, "Skin has become inadequate in interfacing with reality. Technology has become the body's new membrane of existence." And New York Times Magazine states, "Dupont's sculptures aptly demonstrate how scanning, surveillance, and imaging technology shape our conceptions of humanity today." And lastly, from an excerpt of an article for Hyundai Motor Company, they state, "By distorting his own face and body, the artist ponders the notion of identity and individuality in contemporary society, notions that are affected by technology." Dupont suggests that an individual's self-perception is, in fact, always distorted, flawed, and thus removed from their objective existence in reality. Dupont's work demands that his viewers reflect on this point and recognize their limited perspectives as well as their passive consumption of civilization's images. So I look forward to hearing more about Richard's process and mindset. Please welcome Richard Dupont.
Thank you, Lisa. That was a great introduction. Okay, lecture's over. What I wanted to do tonight was to bring you a little bit into my process, and maybe we're going to look at about 12 or 13 years worth of work, maybe a little bit more than that, and then I'm going to just end with some things that I'm working on right now, which are new and not completely realized yet, but you'll get a sense of where they're going. And I say process because for me, the process of art making is really the kind of armature that most of the work comes out of. In other words, I'd like very much to work in a sort of a system where I can kind of go through a series of moves or operations and then maybe end up someplace that I didn't think I was going to at the end. So it brings in this element of chance, which I think is really important for me in terms of working method. And I'm a big fan of a lot of the process artists from the 60s and the 70s, as well as the body and performance artists of the 60s and the 70s. And the notion of using one's own body as the raw material for a work of art. And in around 2001, I began experimenting with scanning my body, and I thought that, I I couldn't really figure out how I could make a performance piece that would communicate what I was interested in communicating, which at that time really had to do a lot with the sort of onset of digital technology. And it's really not going back very far in terms of years, but if you think about where we were in, say, the year 2000 compared to the world we live in today, it's kind of astonishing, like how far we've come. I mean, the internet basically didn't really, wasn't really a major factor even that long ago. And then now we're really on the cusp of like a virtual reality experience, which I think I'll touch on a little bit later, but which I think is going to be a revolution on the order of we can't even imagine how powerful that's going to be. And I think it will be probably the most significant development since the printing press in terms of technology and its impact. So when I started out, I mean, I had a kind of a creeping sensation, I would call it, maybe a feeling that this incursion of technology, this increasing presence of technology, was really dramatically changing us as human beings, and changing our brains, changing our behavior patterns. And more specifically, I was kind of troubled by the sort of increasing commodification of the body and the increasing sort of turning people into data and demographics and targeting them and mapping them and surveilling them and all that. And of course, again, it's just almost staggering to be standing here talking about that now. And it's really only 15 years ago, but the transition, the changes have been just as somebody who's kind of gone through it, almost 50 years old now. So I look back on the last 15 years just in astonishment of what's happened. This is an image of a scan that I did of my head, and it goes back to quite early on, around 2002, and that's an image of me getting the head scanned. And so the idea was that I kind of felt as though I wanted to, I wanted to make a piece using my own body, making it kind of a performative piece, or a body art piece. But I decided that instead of using my actual body, I was going to create a kind of a doppelganger or a virtual version of myself, like a surrogate, a digital version. And so that's why I decided to get myself scanned. So initially it was pretty hard to find anybody to do a scan. I found a video game company on Long Island that was producing the game Doom, which was really popular back then. And I could go out there, they let me rent the head scanner. So I went out and for a small fee I got the scanner and I scanned my head. And again, that's just the polygonal rendering showing all the geometry of the surface. A 3D model is what it is of the head. And of course now, this kind of polygonal design has just become so ubiquitous, it's everywhere. I think I said, went by a gas station the other day that was a polygonal gas station, which I thought was kind of crazy. And so initially what I did with that scan data is on the computer using a really simple CAD program, I compressed the head down to 1/3 of its size on a single axis. So when you view the head from the sides, it looks normal. From the front and the back, it's compressed like a Giacometti. And in order to do the whole rest of the sculpture, I used just much more rudimentary kind of analog process. I made a body cast with plaster bandage and poured expanding foam into it to make a replica of the body. And then I cut it up on a bandsaw in little slices, almost like an egg slicer. And I removed 1/3 of the material from the body, and then kind of scrunched it back together and hand sculpted it. And then I made the clothing with the help of a puppeteer. And for the hands, I actually made a silicone mold, and then I squeezed the silicone mold, deforming the cavity in the exterior of it, and then poured the resin into it while it was deformed and let it kick. And then when I pulled it out, I had a squeezed hand. So I kind of came up with all these tricks to to do what the computer had done with the head, but I did all the other stuff by hand. Eventually I made 3 more of them. So the first one existed as a single piece, and then these 3 became a single work in and of themselves, a tableau of 3 figures. And I showed this in New York in 2004 in one of my earliest solo gallery shows. And to my surprise, the Museum of Modern Art got interested and heard about the work and came down, and a number of curators came down, and eventually the work ended up getting purchased for the collection. And that kind of opened up a lot of doors for me at that time, but it also gave me, emboldened me more to continue down the path of where I was going. And so the next step was that I decided I had to do the whole body. I had to find a way to get the whole body scanned. And again, it was this kind of fairly time-consuming project. How do I scan my whole body? I went and searched online, and there wasn't much to be found. The only places that one could do it at that time, in 2004, there were 2 avenues. One was the movie business, and I could go out to Hollywood and get it done with a special effects studio out there. And the other was the military-industrial complex. I could go to the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and with General Dynamics do the scan. They let people come there and you pay them a small fee and they scan you and give you the scan data, but you have to agree to take part in their anthropometry experiment, basically. So I agreed to do that, and I had nightmares about going there for a couple weeks, and then I eventually kind of got over that and flew out to Dayton and met up with a guy, and we went onto the facility, and the facility was really interesting. They had all kinds of really advanced crash test dummies and these ejection seat chambers, and it was like something out of a science fiction movie. But the body scan itself and the anthropometry examination was all very traditional. So it was just basically these 2 interns with calipers kind of measuring every square inch of my body, like writing it all down. And then that is the document that came out of it. And I got all the scan data back, and they wouldn't let me take off my clothes in the base for legal reasons. So I had to go and spend a good deal of time casting different sections of my body the traditional way in plaster, and then scanning those in separately and kind of piecing it all together. So it took this whole kind of process of contacting the base and going out there and doing the scan and getting the data, working on the data, casting all the other sections of the body, scanning those in, piecing it all together. Every time I did any kind of scan or any of the casting, I had to make sure that my body was exactly the same weight. So I had to sort of stay on somewhat of a, not a regimen, but just I had to make sure that I wasn't skewing my weight dramatically or eating right before I did anything, because there's a lot of change that takes place in the body just on a daily basis. To get it all to line up, I had to do that, and it took a long time. And the end result was this complete model of the body. So this is a digital model, complete digital model of the body. It's over 2 million polygons. So at this time, some of the most advanced Pixar movies, the best models in those movies would maybe be 50,000 polygons. So of course we've gone, just light years beyond that now with CGI and everything. But back then it was still pretty rudimentary. So a model with 2 million polygons was like a big model back then. And every time I tried to load it on the computer would crash. The reason it's bald is because when you scan your head, if you have hair, it just doesn't show up. It looks like a big hole in the head. So I shaved my head to get a really good scan of the head. But also I wanted this completely generic, homogeneous kind of version of myself, because this is not a self-portrait. This is just meant to be a digital body. So it's me, my surrogate, metaphorically standing in for anybody's body. It's a body basically, but just a body that's been through this process of being scanned and reconstructed digitally. So early on, I made some animations, really basic, kind of dumb animations. This one was called Forced to Stand, and it's probably really the only work in the animation that I made that I consider to be like a finished piece. And it's a looping thing that goes on forever, and it's basically just this model. I use the software that's not like traditional animation software. It's basically a program where you apply forces to the model to make it do things, to make it walk and run around and jump or whatever. And in this instance, all the forces are being applied to just keep it from entropically collapsing. So the tendency of the model is to just want to collapse. So, and then every time it's about to collapse, there's a force that's applied that kind of like, forces it back up. Watching it over time, it ends up kind of feeling like this thick board, digital person is being tortured or something. So it does have to do with, kind of endurance performance art or some like, maybe some of the more, visceral kind of performance pieces of, say, for Spurton or Vendetta. But this again is like just a digital construct. It's it's a virtual character, being as a stand-in, things being done to, rather than an actual person. And so I didn't really continue with the animation as part of the work. I just didn't like the working process of it. It was just too much time, behind a computer screen and with too little control over what was happening. But I'm happy with this one piece. And it's possible to maybe I'll return at some point to doing it. There's certainly been a lot of advances in, and more artists using this type of kind of digital animation. So I think maybe it would be easier for me to use now that I know I've got that. And that same year, I got invited by Art Basel in Miami to do a solo project in one of the shipping containers. They used to have a section at Art Basel called Positions, where they invited single artists to do an installation in the shipping container on the beach, and there were like a dozen or so shipping containers. And so I made a proposal which they accepted, and this was the work that I showed there. It's an animatronic sculpture. It's slightly larger than life size, and the piece is titled Head Spinning. So the pun of the title, it's meant to just be a kind of a site-specific work about the experience of an art fair, with all the attendant spectacle and distraction and just the insanity of it. I've been down a couple times before in smaller fairs and kind of left feeling like just totally depleted and exhausted. And so when they asked me for a proposal, this is sort of what I thought of. And so this was a very difficult sculpture to make, though, and kind of unlike any of the other works I made in so much as it's animatronic. So the head actually spins at an RPM that's so fast that it just appears to be a blur, but the rest of the figure is static. And it's essentially silent. It makes a slight noise. But getting the head to do that properly and getting the whole thing to work was a complicated affair. After I got the scan of the complete scan of the body, I began to distort, in the computer, I began to distort the full figure the way I had distorted that early piece I showed you that was kind of squeezed on one axis. So I began distorting figures on single axes, so sort of stretching them out diagonally or stretching them out this way or stretching them out that way. And the result of that was that when the viewer walked around these figures and they were kind of shifting and morphing, there was this kind of perceptual thing that was happening that was interesting because it was related to sort of a perceptual or a visual distortion, but because they were sculptural, it was somehow different. And then also the fact they were bodies made the effect different as well. So you can see here is a 3D printed figure. When I first started doing 3D printing, it's almost impossible to find anybody to do it, but within about a year of getting interested in using it, there was an explosion in the industry, and then all of a sudden there were just like hundreds of companies doing it. And I think it was because of an explosion in the biotech sector. There were a couple of different industries that started using it heavily, and then all of a sudden it was a lot easier to find it and cheaper to have it done. And so I started to use it. And so you can see the clear figure there is a 3D printed figure, and the one closer to us is one in a cast archival resin. And I used this same resin for many, many years. It's a great material, and it's very workable. You can sand it or patch it or do things to it after it's been cast. And I never wanted any of the figures to be painted. I've never been interested in photography and sculpture, although I will admit that when I started out I really didn't like Dwayne Hansen that much, but now I'm kind of a huge fan of Dwayne Hansen, although I don't see his work as really all that related to what I do. But for me, I never wanted to paint the figures, so I liked the idea that I could pigment the resin and then cast them in this pigmented resin to give them a fleshiness, to give them a sort of approximation of a fleshy real person, but without getting into a heavy level of realism. So it was just more about kind of conveying the data information accurately, making them accurate, but not making them sort of photographic. So I started making a lot of these, and then eventually I started grouping them together into single works. So this is one piece made up of, I guess there's 9 or 8 or something. I showed this in New York with Tracy Williams in a show I did in 2005. And at that time, the curator from the Beaver House collection saw the exhibition, and they approached me about doing a proposal for a project. And so this is the Beaver House. That's an image of a project that Sarah Morris did there, painting the ceiling of the whole, the lobby, and the sort of cantilever structure over the exterior. Because there's a whole kind of covered exterior, and then there's a sculpture garden that was originally designed by Isamu Noguchi. The building was built in, I believe, in 1953 or 52. Gordon Bunshaft, it was the architect, but it was the first glass and steel skyscraper in New York City. When they built it, as I said, Noguchi designed the sculpture garden, and they intended for that terrific glass vitrine, the lobby space there, to be a space for exhibiting sculpture, modern sculpture, which they did in the beginning apparently. But then it wasn't too long thereafter that it really just became kind of a corporate lobby. For many, many years it stayed that way until about 10 or 15 years ago, when a new tenant came in and took over the building, refurbishing it all back to its original condition, including the refurbishing the sculpture garden back to the exact design that Noguchi had originally used. And then at the same time initiating this program called the Beaver House Sculpture Collection, where they commission 3 or 4 artists a year to do these really large-scale, site-specific interventions in the lobby. And so in New York, it's been a great tradition. Unfortunately, the curator passed away a couple of years ago, and after a good decade or so of very interesting projects, they've taken a hiatus right now. They've just started again a little bit, which is good. But it's great because it's the location is just so central in Manhattan, and just a tremendous amount of business and pedestrian activity around that area. So highly visible site, and a great kind of site if you want to make a kind of a statement about New York City. And so they accepted the proposal, so I started working on basically a very large version of that piece. So there are 9 figures. And I'm going to show some process images to give a sense of how I was making them. I've used a lot of 3D printing and CNC milling in the work, and that's not really different than most sculptors these days. People, when they point up from a small maquette to a really big sculpture, these days tend to use the CNC carving machine, so they'll carve it, they'll scan their maquette into the computer, and then the computer will send the data to, basically it's just a drill bit on a robotic arm that moves in many different axes, and that thing carves really, really with a tremendous kind of sensitivity. You'd be amazed to see how these things carve. It carves the thing out of different materials at almost any scale. And So well, for me, the idea of like using 3D printing or 3D scanning or CNC carving was again sort of tied to this idea of the body kind of going into this kind of process. In other words, the process represents a kind of a digital fabrication technique, and as a construct that's kind of an imposition on the body. So it's like putting oneself into the machinery literally, and that's kind of how I looked at it. And I still very much look at it that way. It's not just a way of kind of enlarging, but it kind of functions conceptually for me in the work. And so what you see here is the areas that I wanted more detail in, like the head and the hands, for example. I use 3D printing because it produces a better result. But it's a little more expensive than milling, so the milling was for bigger areas of the body. And then you can see these are all kind of bits and pieces pieced together. The gray figure represents one that's had all the pieces kind of combined together, so all the 3D printed pieces and all the foam pieces all combined together, and then glued together, and then sanded and painted that gray, and sanded again to sort of unify the whole thing. And then you can see off to the right, there's a giant mold, and then to the left, the flesh-colored figure is the final casting that's come out of the mold. So the mold gets created around that gray thing, then the gray thing gets taken out of the mold and just put aside, and then the mold is an empty cavity, and then the resin gets kind of poured and brushed into that mold, and ultimately popped out of that mold as a casting, as a replica. So really the fleshy thing is a replica of the gray thing, basically. And that's a basic kind of mold making rundown, but that's when my work tends to go back more in a traditional vein. So I do use some of these more advanced digital fabrication techniques to kind of realize a prototype, and then the mold making and casting will often be much more traditional, like in bronze, for example. And that's just an example of the figure getting molded to silicone rubber. Most molds have two parts, kind of an interior silicone, which is a rubbery thing, which picks up every single little detail off the original thing that you're molding it from, and then an out exterior shell, which kind of holds the silicone in place. And that's an image of one of the things getting popped out, the casting getting popped out. That's an image of the piece installed at the end in the Beaver House. And again, just so much pedestrian traffic around this area. The whole idea with these works, again, is as you move around them, and at this scale, this effect is really compounded. As you move around them, they change. So from different points of view, they appear dramatically different. And it's only in this sort of active, kinesthetic act of moving, walking around them, that they activate and they start moving and shifting. And this becomes an effect that's not just kind of an optical or perceptual effect, it's sort of a physiological effect. You sort of feel it in your body. And it's also compounded by the uncanny kind of sensation that we get when we see bodies that are slightly different than what we normally are used to looking at. And so all of that worked quite well, and I was very happy because it did achieve this kind of other thing, because it just kind of went beyond the individual figures, and it really got into this immersive installation environment where you're walking around through the whole thing, things are changing, they're morphing, you're also experiencing in the context of the thousands of pedestrians that are walking around outside and all the busyness of the city. There was this very sort of obvious, apparent kind of discord between the vulnerability and the sort of creepy fleshiness of the figures in the lobby, and the stark nature of the lobby, and the sort of coldness of the city, and the armor of everybody walking around in the city. Another thing that I found interesting was that you can see there's this kind of grid that runs through the marble terrazzo floor, and it doesn't just run through the lobby, it runs through like the whole block out into the sculpture garden, which is up to the right, out to the other side as well. And it's a grid, so it's this kind of metaphorical grid of the grid of Manhattan, because Manhattan is sort of famously this gridded sort of Cartesian city where it's super linear and organized. And all of that I thought was appropriate. The notion of this imposition of data, of kind of rigor or order, onto the sort of human experience. And so that's another image of it, much quieter moment. When I had the body scanned, I was conscious, at the time I was really thinking a lot about Greek sculpture, and I've been influenced a lot by the history of sculpture and earlier works, and I'll talk a little bit about it at the end because I'm making some pieces now which are referencing 19th century sculpture. But so I consciously put out the left foot, like the Greek chorus figure, mimicking that pose basically. The idea of like just that 1 foot forward kind of activates the figure. It implies movement in some way, and it also, again, it kind of connects these things back with those much earlier things. And I've speculated a lot about how those works were made and how they work, and what they have. They have a kind of power that you don't get from looking at like a Bernini or from a lot of Renaissance sculpture. It's a kind of a quiet, simplified form, which I find very effective. And so a lot of people wanted to touch the work, which I always know that it's like an interesting sculpture when people want to kind of go up and like really investigate it and touch it. Because they're curious about the material, they kind of want to have the kind of confirmation of like what it is they're looking at. And I always like this picture. It's almost like he's sort of testing if it's real or something. The idea of like creating something in the computer and then actually putting it out in the real world, to me, is very interesting. I'm a pretty traditional artist in the sense that I have a lot of faith and belief in physical objects in the material world. And I also like the idea of this kind of juxtaposition between something that's coming from a digital space but then ends up becoming a physical thing. And so I've made a lot of work that I would consider to be, in this regard, like very confrontational with technology, or very critical of technology, because I'm sort of insisting on lived experience and on a physical human interaction between people, and not in some kind of virtual utopian paradigm of technology in the future. As far as that goes, I think it's probably a lot more science fiction, dark science fiction, than some kind of utopian optimistic space, especially with the onset of virtual reality, which I'll talk about a little bit in the end. But so right after that, I made these works, and this is an installation. Again, it's a single piece, and it's in a mirrored environment. And I made this almost right after I made the Beaver House exhibition, and I was inspired in some way by the reflections in the glass and the terrazzo, the reflective floor of the Beaver House, and the city, and seeing the figures kind of distorted in that way. So I used this software where I kind of pass a wave through the model, and it's kind of make it wobbly or distorted. But again, with these figures, as you walk around it, there's a place where they snap into alignment. They look relatively normal. And then as you move out of that axis, they get all wobbly. And so those came really right afterwards. And this is in late 2008. And at that time, that was right around the time of the collapse of Lehman Brothers and the recession sort of hitting. And it really changed a lot of things for a lot of artists in the art world. And I, like many others, found myself kind of thrust back into a space where I was just kind of alone again in the studio. I didn't have I didn't have projects kind of coming in with the regularity that I had before. I didn't have production budgets and things like that people were giving to me to make things. It really just almost all of a sudden in a couple of months just changed dramatically and kind of just shut down. And so I spent a little time trying to kind of figure out how I was going to move forward. And what I ended up doing was kind of solving a couple of problems at the same time. One was like, okay, what am I going to make? It can't be that expensive to make. And two, what am I going to do with all this stuff that I've been accumulating for the last like 15 years? So both in terms of the studio practice and work environment and all of the stuff that had built up around the making of sculpture for a decade, plus having children and all of their junk, and all this material became a real hindrance, and I didn't want to just kind of throw it all away. I didn't want to just dump it. And so I started thinking about ways in which I could incorporate all this stuff into the work. And I decided I would make these molds, large head kind of molds, and that's bigger. It's about, I don't know if it's twice the size, but the heads are fairly large. They're about 26 inches tall. So it's about half of the size of that, roughly, maybe a little bigger than that. They're solid cast resin with objects embedded inside. They weigh about 200 pounds, so they're extremely dense and heavy. The way in which they work is basically like, you can imagine the mold of the head is almost like an upside down like a garbage can, right side up garbage can. And all of the objects just kind of get dumped or placed into that cavity, and then the resin gets poured in, and it takes up all of the space that's not occupied by an object, and then you take it out of the mold, and it's one solid thing, and all of that material has been preserved, embedded, like frozen inside of the solid resin casting. The resin that I use, again, it's a UV stable polyurethane resin. So what's fascinating to me about that is that the resin itself is a really sophisticated material, and it's non-yellowing. Of course, one thinks of the French sculptor Armand, who's famous for his accumulations of objects in resin from the 60s. There's also Martin Kippenberger made a number of pieces in resin. Both of those artists' works are now, the resin started out clear, but now it's green or yellow, because the material was much less sophisticated back then. So now we have this resin that is yellowing. It's going to last for thousands of years possibly, and it's also UV stable. So everything that's embedded inside is also protected from the UV rays. So in that sense, the color of all the things inside these heads is going to be preserved as a sort of time capsule, and then the specificity of that color, which looks kind of normal to us now, in many years is going to be, I think, quite different feeling. So I think that's going to be interesting. I started out making these, and I just kind of kept making them. Again, the process was like so perfectly suited to me because I'm kind of working inside out and upside down and sticking things into the mold. So I don't really have control or complete control over what I'm doing or what I'm going to end up with. So that every time I then would turn the mold up right side up and take it out of the mold, the piece out of the mold, it would be a surprise to some degree. And I never knew what I was going to get. So it was just like a Christmas morning every time. And so I just kept making them, and they were all really different. Initially, I was thinking, this is great because I don't have to think about composition. I'm just going to dump everything in there and just see what happens. But then, of course, no matter what, you realize you can't get away from composition. It's unavoidable, which is probably a good thing. But I kept making them because they were so different each time. I mean, when you can see they're getting a little more, organized in terms of color or what have you. In some, I just kind of used a single object or single material. I did a number that were just photographs or postcards, both my photographs from many years of taking pictures when I was younger, and found photographs, found postcards, my postcards. So a mixture between my experiences and my memories and other people's experiences and their memories, and more sort of clearly referencing or articulating this idea of memory that is definitely at play in a lot of, in all of these heads, this notion of kind of freezing experiences or mementos or aspects of life and then somehow you can then reflect on them a little bit more as sort of detached or removed from reality or from our space. And so in that sense, they have to do, with the experience of memory, what is it, physicalizing it somehow. There's another with photographs. Again, I also like the idea of a lot of the sculpture that I've made, it's sculptural work, but it also it's very related to the two-dimensional, so all of the body scan stuff is really a three-dimensional photograph, like a picture of the object, the body. And then a work like that, it's an interesting combination of using a photograph or photographs in a solid sculptural form. I've always been interested very much in this space in between sculpture and photography. I think it's a really rich area, again, because even just looking at this right now, this is a different work than the actual work itself, because it's a photograph of the thing, and as such, it's totally flattened out. It becomes something completely different than the experience of standing in front of this volume. So I made quite a number of them. You can see here I've used like a lot of discarded earlier fragments of things, castings or objects that were kind of like false starts or things that were messed up, or I used about 8,000 pounds of junk, of studio detritus and materials and even trash in these works. I made about 40 something of them, and the experience of just getting rid of all of that material was super cathartic, and was a great illustration, I think, of like when art and life kind of do dovetail together nicely, because making art has a lot to do with structuring your life in a way that you can actually make art. And in this instance, it was literally making art out of a problem that was existing in the other aspects of my life. And in doing that, then was able to kind of look at all of that junk and sort of step back from it and see it in all of its accumulation. And it became an interesting kind of study in like material culture. When people go and look at the heads, they always find things that they've owned, or there's just so much of a overlap between the things that we all accumulate. So the idea behind these originally was, for that very reason, to have like a whole installation of like 50 of them together, and to see the sort of scale of all of that stuff together, all of the material kind of in that one experience of taking it all in. And it just wasn't feasible at the time to do that. So I kept making them, and it's a back of one. And then one of my dealers said, well, we should, let's do a show. And she just kind of called me up one day, I think in March, and offered me a May show. And that does happen sometimes, and it's always nice when that happens, because a lot of times you wait around for like 6 months or a year, even more, for an exhibition. It's just the nature of the art world and how things are scheduled. So when something happens like really quickly like that, it's just really gratifying, because it's like, if you've got something that's just ready to go, you can just kind of show it and kind of keep things moving quickly, and it's just nice. So this was 10 of them together in an exhibition. So that was as close to my, my initial desire of like doing 50. I had a museum a couple of years ago that was very interested in doing all of them, but the project unfortunately fell through at the end. So someday I'd like to bring them all back together and do that. That's a picture of one of the heads installed at the Middlebury College Museum of Art, and they wanted to juxtapose a couple of the sculptures with works from different periods in their collection. So again, this kind of looking at material culture accumulation through this, from a more historical kind of lens. So at a certain point, it just seemed like I had to do just a life casting of my head. The life cast or the life mask, the death mask, the earliest kind of sculptural capturing of the human body of the face. And it's really different than doing a scan. A scan is just this kind of generic thing. It sort of neutralizes whatever in the news, whatever it's scanning, whereas the life cast just captures everything in minute detail. It's not a process I would recommend anybody undertake because it's like being entombed inside of a helmet with no eyesight, no hearing. Your nose is plugged up. You just have one little hole for breathing for about an hour, and it's pretty hard it's actually panic attack inducing. You have to just kind of really try and calm yourself down and relax through the whole thing. And of course, when they were doing it to me, one of the assistants accidentally put the plaster bandage across my breathing hole, and so I was basically giving the I can't breathe signal, and they were able to take an X-Acto knife and just kind of poke it in the exact right place, thank goodness, and open up that breathing hole again. So I ended up getting a great mold from that session, and then I made a plaster cast, a really good plaster cast of the face. And for this, I kept the hair. I had some facial hair too, so there was all kinds of weirdness going on, and it captured a lot of it. And then from that, I made a single, very large thing out of foam, CNC carved version of that life mask, but at a much bigger scale. It's probably about that tall, coming off the podium. Pretty big. And I used that to make one large resin head with material embedded inside of it. And then I decided not to make any more, and I had this this foam thing left over. And I was trying to kind of think of ways of repurposing it or using it for a new piece. I really like the idea of recycling older stuff in the newer work. And so I decided one day, maybe I'll just brush a coat of rubber across it and see if I can do something with it. And that didn't really work out. But I peeled it off and tried to kind of peel it or rip it off of the head form. And so this is kind of interesting because normally when you think of making a mold and casting a mold, you think of making a negative space and pouring the material into that negative space and then popping it out. But this is a positive mold, so it's almost like those glove molds that you see sometimes in antique shops, those little porcelain hands. You brush the rubber over that, it dries, and you pull it off, and you've got like a rubber glove. So this is it, it's a positive form. This is an example of that, with rubber brushed over it and then peeled off. So when I peeled it off for the first time, it came off in one piece, which completely shocked me. And I was just kind of standing there with this large, sagging mask or skin. And I had this immediate impulse to nail it to the wall, which I did, and it was just a complete accident. I mean, an absolute accident in the studio. Really, the only time that I've had an accident like that. And I just was immediately so interested in what it was doing, how it connected with all of this earlier work that it's always been a touchstone for me. I've been looking at Robert Overby and Eva Hesse and Bruce Nauman and artists like that my whole life. I'm interested in this whole idea of process and how process art kind of can intersect with body art and performative work and so forth. So it just seemed to touch on a lot of that. So I got very excited, and then I went back and figured out how to replicate that process but with a much more sturdy archival material. And so I made a number of these, not a lot, I made about 15, and they're pretty vulnerable as works. I mean, a lot of them come back for conservation already. It's just the nature of the material and what's happening, and they really are like process pieces. But I did a show with Caroline Niche in New York of these works. And right around the same time, I was asked to be in an exhibition at the Museum of Arts and Design in New York. And it was a show called Out of Hand, Materializing the Post-Digital, which is kind of looking at digital fabrication and architecture and design and art. And they wanted to put a sculpture of mine in the show, but they also had an idea of wanting to put a very large-scale piece out in front of the museum, which they had never done before. And they asked me if I had any ideas about that. And basically, it was right when I was making these things, so I thought, you know, it'd be fascinating to turn one of these sort of soft, processy pieces back into a solid casting. So what we're doing here, you can see, is we're sort of hanging one of these things off of a tripod with a stick attached to it. We were able to get the scanner around it to scan it and capture it on the computer. And then that's a digital model of that thing. And then I proposed it to them, and they accepted it. So we set about turning that into a 15-foot cast aluminum sculpture. So you can see there's sections that are being milled out of foam. And then that is a section of the work having cast, just freshly cast in aluminum. And then ultimately all the cast pieces are sort of, you know, welded together, finished. This is the piece in the foundry. And that's the finished work in front of the museum. It was up on Columbus Circle for a year. It was a big favorite of dogs in the neighborhood. It was kind of equally loved and hated by a lot of people, which is, I think, what public sculpture is all about. It's definitely not your typical plop art. It's not shiny, it's not colorful, it's not innocuous, it's kind of ugly, and hopefully, you know, it can provoke, or did provoke, some thought. For me, it was kind of, you know, this sort of almost tragicomic kind of mask, like a vaudeville mask hanging kind of in space, or a piece about identity being kind of peeled away or stripped away from us. The idea of making a monumental kind of Easter Island-esque head about the sort of loss of identity was sort of an interesting idea to me. But it was up for a year in Columbus Circle and really needed to be power washed after it came down, which it was. So I also had been working for a little while. Right around then, I kind of started to put together some works that I had been slowly assembling for about 3 or 4 years, based on not my body. It was another body. It was a woman's body, and it was kind of a composite of my wife's body and another friend of mine. And the reason that happened was because my wife didn't want to have her whole body scanned and go through all of that nonsense. So I found another friend of mine who did. And so I scanned her body, and then I had head scans and plaster casts and things like that of the hands and feet of my wife, and I kind of combined the two together to create a complete model. The only reason to do that was just to get a complete model of a woman's body. And I started to create a series of works that were really distorted, almost sort of funhouse mirror distortion, playing with surrealism to some degree. This is just one of the works you can see here. It's being milled, and this is milled out of wood and then glued together, working at a foundry in Washington State called Walla Walla Foundry. That's doing really great work. I'm doing another piece with them right now. And that's a finished piece. So it's basswood. For me, the idea of making a piece out of this like completely inorganic form in the most organic of materials was interesting. And so that became the kind of cornerstone of a show I did in 2015 that brought together some of these earlier works. That's an earlier resin piece. It's based on my body, but all the other works here, pictured, are based on this model of my wife and my friend Lillian combined. These pieces are kind of referencing all kinds of things. They're referencing sort of futurism and early modernist sculpture, like an art or a Brancusi, certainly surrealism, and this kind of brought a number of those together as in one kind of installation. 2015. Around that time, I started to make paintings. Again, I haven't shown a lot of the prints tonight, but I've been making a lot of prints and drawings and stuff throughout this whole process. Many of which were like that first image I showed, based on the kind of polygonal line rendering of the models. And so I've been thinking for a while about how to make some paintings. I started out very early in my career as a painter before going on to everything else. And in the last few years, I've really gone back into making a lot of more 2D work in addition to sculpture. So these were screen printed based on a very large hand. That piece is about to scale, as you're looking at it right there. That's about as big as it is in real life. Maybe it's a little bigger. So there's I have a large screen that I made of just a digital image of one of the hands. And then I just used that screen to print over and over again. So in this instance, what I'm doing is I'm just screen printing it, and then while it's still wet, I'm just turning it, printing it again, printing it again. I use a screen that has a mesh that's kind of open, so the ink like really runs through it and makes kind of a mess and get a lot of imperfections. And so the idea really with these is to create a painting using the silkscreen technique. It's the photomechanical technique, which is usually pretty accurate, kind of tight, but use it in a more painterly way. And so I made a number of these works that are kind of going back to the earliest prints that I made. But they're just much larger. They're on canvas. Some of them are unstretched. Some of them are stretched. This is pretty big. This is even bigger than it is appearing on this slot on the screen here. It's about 10 feet long. There's a whole series of them installed in the studio. That's a pretty large piece. And again, the same kind of form repeating over and over and over again. And then when I'm making them, I'm just kind of standing on top of it and then doing it quite quickly. It's almost like a type of drawing in a way. And then that led into some works that I've been doing really recently. This is a cyanotype on canvas. So cyanotype is a great photographic process. It's one of the very first photo processes. It is achieved by very simple means, which separates it out from almost every other photo process. Almost every other photo process is silver-based. Cyanotype is iron-based. It's two chemicals that you mix together and you brush on a surface, and then you expose them in sunlight, and you get that deep cyan blue. So this is about the size of the actual work. In these pieces, what I started doing was brushing the chemicals into canvas, saturating the canvas with the chemicals. And it took a little while for me to kind of figure out the right kind of canvas that would absorb them properly. And the end result was this very deep, rich blue saturated into the canvas. So they became as much about kind of painting and color field painting in a way as they are about photography or about a digital source or any of that. And this is one of the first ones where I just used a lot of films that I had used for earlier works, for screen prints or for etchings, and I took all those clear films and just kind of layered them on top of the sensitized canvas, exposed it in the sun. And then with cyanotype, they develop in water, so it's this incredibly simple process that anybody can do it. You just need to buy the two chemicals at a photographic supply store, mix them together in water, coat a piece of paper, take it outside with a transparency negative on top of it, or even just some objects that you found on top of it, and expose it in the sun for 15 minutes or so, and then just wash it out in water. So it's the kind of thing that turns up a lot in craft use because of its simplicity. But I started thinking a lot of it. I really got attracted to the process and to the kind of potential for doing it on canvas. And I started thinking a lot about early photography and about the whole, how magical it must have seemed at that time, images just kind of seeming to be conjured out of nowhere, and the idea of things that are invisible being visible. And I started thinking a lot about the whole idea of visibility in art And then that kind of led me to think about Robert Rauschenberg's erased de Kooning drawing, which is really the first artwork that was made by erasing something rather than adding to something. So, as the story goes, Rauschenberg showed up on de Kooning's studio doorstep one night with a bottle of Jack Daniels and proceeded to try and convince de Kooning to give him a drawing to erase as a work of art. Now, Rauschenberg had been at that time hanging out a lot with John Cage, exploring kind of Buddhist notions about sort of disappearance of materiality. He had been making the white paintings. He had been experimenting with the erasure in his own drawings, but he just said they just looked like erased, smudgy drawings. So he thought, okay, maybe if I erase something that's considered a work of art, that would work. Maybe that would work as an erasure. And so he thought, well, I can't erase, like a Rembrandt drawing or something like that, because that would be just perceived as sort of an act of vandalism or what have you. So I've got to erase a drawing by somebody who everyone considers to be great and an artist, but who's not part of art history. So immediately he thought, all right, I'm going to pass it to Kooning. So de Kooning initially was a little hesitant that night, apparently, and eventually came around to agreeing to doing it. So Rauschenberg got the drawing. Apparently de Kooning gave him one that was really hard to erase. So it took him, he says, like 30 days and like 50 erasers or something. And eventually he ended up with the erased de Kooning drawing. So those of you that know of this work or have seen it, it's basically just like an empty piece of paper with some smudges on it. But it became the kind of prototypical conceptual artwork, probably as important as anything that Marcel Duchamp ever did, and led to basically all of conceptual art came after this gesture. And the whole idea of the dematerialization of the art object, the idea taking precedent over the form itself, all of that really can be traced back to that thing. And it also has to do with visibility, right? So that's why I was interested in it. I was like, it's about there's something there, and then there's not something there, and then, maybe it could come back. And so I was searching on the web, and I came across this image that was done at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art about 4 years ago in the conservation department using new infrared scanning technology. So all the conservation departments and museums are now using this technology. It's a new thing. And they're using it to scan X-ray works of art to uncover things about their process or how they were created, or this backstory or the mystery or whatever. And in the case of this work, I thought it was kind of brilliant. It basically, brought back what was erased. And so that to me was a fascinating kind of jumping off point for me. So I thought, okay, I'm going to download this image. So I downloaded it, and I began to just mess around with it in Photoshop myself to see if I could get more of it to come back, Or then ultimately I started to take liberties and to mess around with it myself. And it just became kind of conceptually a point of entry for me to start a series of works. This is was one of the first ones. It's, again, a really large cyanotype work on canvas. And they just kind of proceeded from there into a wide variety of different distortions, manipulations, variations on that original JPEG. Removing it, putting it in Photoshop, messing with it, printing up really large negatives, and then exposing them onto the canvas and creating these large-scale works. So that's a recent project, and we're still trying to figure out where that's going to be shown. I'd like to show that kind of all together someplace. And then also another thing I'm working on right now, there's a new series of sculptures that take as a jumping off point 19th century sculpture. So for years I've been really interested in the work of artists from the late 19th, early 20th century. Much of it gets kind of overlooked. So artists like Wilhelm Lambruck or Aristide Maillol, Degas sculpture, Matisse's sculpture. And so I started working with a model from the New York Academy of Art, and she had been just modeling for classes there. And I was invited by my friend Barry X. Ball, who's an artist with a big studio in Brooklyn, to come out and take advantage of this photogrammetry array that he had set up. So what you're looking at here is, it's 100 cameras set up kind of on a scaffold in a circle. And all of the cameras go off simultaneously, capturing the JPEG data. And then all of that data gets translated vis-a-vis software into a three-dimensional model. So it's the other way of basically capturing a 3D model other than scanning it. And the advantage of this is that if you want to, you can have your model moving because the JPEGs all go off instantaneously. So you could have somebody dancing and really you get an amazing frozen kind of action pose if you were so interested in doing that. So this is an image of her being scanned. I put her in a number of what I had done is I printed up images of poses based on these 19th century sculptures that I was interested in, and then kind of went over them with her, and we kind of came up with poses based on those. And some of them were very accurate, some of them were kind of variations that she felt more comfortable in. And that's an image of the data that came out of the scan of her head. Again, you can see how hair is always something that just doesn't really translate very well. And then that's probably a better image of getting a sense of like what the scan data produces, which is captures a decent amount of reality, which I think is pretty interesting. So the works that I'm making took the scans of the model and the various poses, and then set about taking quite a long time, kind of digitally distorting and manipulating them in the computer. The distortions, some of them are kind of simple, like the earlier ones, where it's just sort of squeezed on a single axis, or referencing sort of a more simple kind of formal distortion, and then others are like way more surgical, like going in and like really tweaking certain areas and not tweaking other areas. And then that's a digital rendering of a couple of the works that we're working on right now. And this has all taken a really long time for a variety of reasons. The process itself, again, taking a while. Kind of organizing the funding to get the whole thing kind of underway is taking a while. And you can see this is a rendering of two of them. One of them in the background is based on the Degas ballerina sculpture. And the one in the foreground is based on Wilhelm Lambruck of a woman kind of, it's supposed to be a bather. But the pose really appealed to me. And went in and really kind of distorted certain areas, like that right arm that's just radically pulled up towards the top of the image. Again, the idea with these works is that they are kind of coming from this kind of virtual space, but then very much ending up in this physical space afterwards. And that, to me, has a lot to do with the idea of virtual reality, but in order to experience this, you don't have to put on, the headset and disappear from reality. You can just walk into, a gallery space and have a physical interaction with it. So, on that note, I will